A lovely day to be stood in the graveyard, Dave. Nice one. The other day I was in Weymouth walking along the harbour and I noticed a sign that said the Black Death first entered there during the 14th century. The Black Death was the deadliest outbreak of the disease to ever hit England and Britain, and it's estimated that roughly 50% of the population at the time, around 2 to 3 million people, were killed during the plague outbreak of 1348. The disease and the pestilence, as it was known, kept coming around in the following centuries, and people had no idea how to treat it, prevent it or cure it. But very early on, one thing that became pivotal to preventing the spread of disease was to deal with the dead in a quick and speedy manner. During the medieval period, everyone in England was religious and a Christian. They had to go to church, like the one next to me, every Sunday and give away 10% of their income in any form to the church in the form of what was known as a tithe. People quickly believed that the plague was linked to God and that he was punishing them for their sins on earth. Inside of towns and cities, monks would parade whipping themselves to apologise for the sins of the people. This, of course, did very little. In fact, it probably helped the spread, as people flocked to see what all the fuss was about. But across England today, there are hundreds, possibly even thousands of huge pits, deep graves, in which the victims of the plague were thrown in and were buried. These are known, funnily enough, as plague pits, and they in some cases contain the bodies of hundreds of people. The bubonic plague was nasty when it came around. The victims who got this would have large swellings filled with black pus on their groins and under their armpits, and they suffered with other terrible symptoms, such as a raging fever. The pneumonic plague, which also struck, had a terribly high mortality rate, much higher than the bubonic version of the disease. I'm stood in the graveyard of a church that has its foundations in the medieval period, and there is most probably a plague pit somewhere around here. Local authorities learned that plague pits were the best way of preventing the spread of disease, throwing the corpses in a pit with no pomp or ceremony, and they were sometimes covered over with lime to protect others. Plague pits themselves were actually rather expensive to dig, as many labourers were needed to do this, and they also took many days to do. It was a cheap burial and a quick way of dealing with the dead who had contracted the disease. But these pits are still being discovered to this day. In a town not too far from where I'm stood now, at a place called Thornton Abbey, archaeologists discovered a plague pit, and inside of this 48 skeletons, including the remains of many children, were found. Work was performed on the teeth of the remains, and the bacteria, Yersinia pestis, was discovered, this being the specific bacteria that caused the plague. This was one of only 3 previously identified sites dating back to the 14th century outbreak of the plague, where the bacteria was found upon the victims. The village around Thornton Abbey has a very small rural community, but they were devastated by the Black Death, with whole families being disposed of in the pit. This discovery also showed that all across England during the 14th century, people were being buried in mass graves after they succumbed to the disease. Today in London, whenever any work is being performed on the infrastructure, such as the London Underground network, or when huge building projects get underway with their construction, you can almost guarantee that a plague pit will be found. These pits date back to particularly the deadly outbreak of disease of plague in 1665, which struck London, and the Great Plague as it was known, it's believed, killed 100,000 people, around 1/4 of London's population at the time. Because of the huge amount of death in such a small period, huge pits were dug inside of the capital, wherever was possible, to then inter the dead. People on carts would regularly shout, "Bring out your dead," and they then took them away to their burial in the pit. The graveyards quickly became very full, so plague pits were dug wherever, and the priest would then bless the pit to consecrate the ground. Daniel Defoe, who documented the disease in his book, Journal of a Plague Year, wrote of one of these pits, the one that was discovered where Aldgate Tube Station is today, and he said, and I quote, "A terrible pit it was, and I could not resist my curiosity to go and see it. As near as I may judge, it was about 40 feet in length, and about 15 or 16 feet broad, and at the time I first looked at it, about 9 feet deep. But it was said they dug it near 20 feet deep afterwards in one part of it. They could not go no deeper for the water, for they had, it seems, dug several pits before this. For though the plague was long a-coming to our parish, yet when it did come, there was no parish in or about London where it raged with such violence as in the 2 parishes of Aldgate and Whitechapel." There were dozens of plague pits across London, possibly even hundreds of them. Many lie today untouched and are yet to have been discovered. It was one of the most effective ways of preventing the spread of disease, and it was one of the only things people could do. Throw their loved ones in a mass grave and pray that they weren't infected themselves. But yeah, all across England, plague pits can be found. There's probably one in your local town or village. Creepy, really, knowing that all of those who suffered centuries before lie together in one hole in the ground. And there's probably one somewhere in this churchyard somewhere.